Okay, welcome back to part 3 of the lecture. Please move on to the next slide. Having thought about visual images of witches, I now want us to think about some of the dates and statistics for witchcraft and magical prosecutions. So a third element of knowledge that we're dealing with in this lecture is just what are the stats for this? How many people were prosecuted? What happened to them? And I also want us to think in this final part of the lecture about some of the English demonologists. So you've had a little think about Matthew Hopkins maybe. Let's look at some of the other people, his precursors. So this slide talks you through some of the dates and statistics that are important here. To start with, we have a number of legal parliamentary acts, the Witchcraft Acts, that we need to know about for the module. There's an early one in 1542. I don't want you to really worry too much about that one because it's not enforced during the period when we're looking at witchcraft in the period when Shakespeare was writing. The one that is important is the 1563 Witchcraft Act, passed in the early years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, and an act which prescribes some punishments for witchcraft. If you were found guilty of witchcraft or various kinds of other magical activities, such as, for example, seeking treasure by magic or practicing love magic on somebody, if you were found guilty of that for the first time, you would go to prison for a year and you would have to appear in the pillory 4 times during that time. A pretty uncomfortable thing in itself, and people who went to jail in the Elizabethan period were quite likely to die there of diseases like typhoid, which was known as jail fever in its time, so not a happy thing. But you were not executed for your first offence. If you were found guilty of a second offence, you would be executed. You'd be executed by hanging, as we saw in the illustration on the previous slide. There were 3 witches hanging. So witches were not burned in England. Occasionally they were burned in Scotland for a variety of other reasons, which we'll come on to in the week when we look at Macbeth. But in England, they're hanged. So if somebody says to you, oh, English witches were burned, you know immediately they don't know what they're talking about. They were, in fact, hanged. And that was for a second offence under the Witchcraft Act of 1563. There are a range of other provisions. Get familiar with the text of the Witchcraft Act. It will help you in thinking about how writers like Shakespeare think about witchcraft. And if you want to write a more kind of history-based essay, it will be essential knowledge for the early modern period. What happened under the Act then? We know how people were to be punished if found guilty. How many people fell foul of this? Between 1563 and 1589, around, and we're not entirely certain of all these statistics because we do think that some of the records are missing, around 430 people were prosecuted in the home counties, so the 5 counties around London, for witchcraft or magical related offences, with a peak between 1580 and 1589. Nearly 60% of those were in a single home county though, and that home county was Essex. What's going on in Essex in this period? Why is it so special and different? You can see, and again the statistics are a little bit partial because some records are missing, so slightly different date range. But between 1560 and 1609, at least 53 people were hanged in Essex for witchcraft. That's a massive number of the overall total for that period in just one county. People have hypothesised that maybe Essex is an area where there are a lot of Puritans, and Puritans do tend to want to prosecute witches. Perhaps it's an area where there's a lot of conflict between Protestants, particularly the extreme Puritan kind, and Catholics. Maybe it's because it's a low-lying, marshy sort of place. Maybe it's because it's a place where ideas are easily imported from the European continent in the small ship trade between Holland and places like St Osyth, where some of the first witchcraft prosecutions were brought, places like Chelmsford, places like Malden. We'll come back to Malden in a minute. Is it because of that interchange of ideas? Is it that traffic of ideas coming in from places like Germany? Essex is apparently special and different. So we've dealt with the Elizabethan period, and there are some of the statistics for you to have a think about. What about the Jacobean period? There's a Witchcraft Act that comes in the first year of King James's reign in 1604, which revisits that earlier act, the 1563 Act, and it reinforces provisions against witches. Now you can be executed for your first offence of witchcraft. You will be hanged if you're found guilty of any single witchcraft or magical offence. There are also a range of other provisions, and they're very relevant for next time when we come back to talking about Macbeth. There are provisions, for example, about digging up dead bodies and using their parts in witchcraft. We see the witches in Macbeth doing this. So here is another act to be aware of, and again there are further prosecutions under this act. You can look at those statistics and follow this journey through English history for yourself. There's some further reading recommended on this slide as well, and I would suggest you have a look at these. There are two key English demonologists that you might want to know about alongside the Witchcraft Acts. These are Reginald Scot and George Gifford, and you can see them described on this slide here. Scott writes a book called The Discovery of Witchcraft, comes out in 1584 and is highly influential with a lot of writers of the period. We know Shakespeare read this one, and we think a lot of his friends who wrote plays and poems about witchcraft and magic in this period did so. Because it's this great compendium of witchcraft stories, Scott's a very lively, controversialist writer. He tells a lot of stories about witchcraft in a very amusing fashion. He's quite unlike the other writer, George Gifford, who is a Puritan minister and has a lot more seriousness of intent. Scott has often been accused of not really even believing in witchcraft at all. Not sure that's entirely true, but I think he was sceptical of many of the things that were claimed about witches. Gifford is a lot more credulous or is a lot more devout, depending on the way you look at him. He writes a dialogue concerning witches and witchcraft in 1593, and although he's a lot more earnest than Scott in a number of ways, his dialogue is indeed in the form of a dialogue, is like a play. And we do think, although there's not such clear evidence, that a lot of the dramatists of the early modern period, particularly Shakespeare, knew this work or had read it or had it read to them or had encountered it in various ways, perhaps in snippet form or in conversation. We think he knew this source. Both of them strike a very practical tone. They're rather unlike the writers of the Malleus Maleficarum, who are very concerned with theological matters, are very concerned with discussing really quite difficult concepts like matter and spirit and how it is that witches can have sex with devils and so on. Scott and Gifford are a lot more interested in questions like, if I think there's a woman in my village who's a witch, what should I do about her? Is it fair to accuse her of this crime or that crime? How should I proceed against her? Is it really true that witches have animal familiars? Can we say that these are devils or not? What should happen to these animals? So they're quite practical in a number of ways. It's a sort of English stereotype, isn't it? That these people are sceptical and that these people are also quite practical. In this case, they actually are. If you go on to the next couple of slides, you'll see some extracts from Scott and Gifford's work. And I want to read you particularly the one from Reginald Scott's work, because I think the tone of it is really important, and you can see the way that this transmutes into early modern plays. He tells a story in his own voice to start with, but then he switches into the voice of the accuser. And that moment where he just ventriloquises what witchcraft accusers are thinking about is really interesting. It's about throwing your voice, it's about adopting a character, it's about putting yourself in another person's place and imagining what they might feel like as they point the finger and say witch to their neighbour. So he's doing something dramatic, he's doing something poetic. Think about that. And think about what he says the witch is. Think about what he imagines the person who is accusing the witch to think that she is. What is a witch? What is an accuser? What's the relationship between these people? I therefore, he says to his readers, at this time do only desire you, the readers, to consider of my report concerning the evidence that is commonly brought before you against them. He's writing for an audience of magistrates. He's writing for people of his own class who might have witches brought up before them in the law courts and might need to make decisions about what happens to them. See first, he says, whether the evidence be not frivolous, whether the proofs brought against them be not incredible, consisting of guesses, presumptions, and impossibilities, contrary to reason, scripture, and nature. See also what persons complain upon them, whether they be not of the basest, the most unwisest, the most faithless kind of people. These sound awfully like the ignorant peasants in the Monty Python sketch. Also may it please you to weigh what accusations and crimes they lay to their charge, namely, she was at my house of late, she would have had a pot of milk. She departed in a chafe because she had it not. She railed, she cursed, she mumbled and whispered. And finally she said she would be even with me. And soon after my child, my cow, my sow, or my pullet died. all was strangely taken. Nay, if it please your worship, and you can imagine him thinking about the accuser kind of leaning into the justice, saying, this awful witch, you must get rid of her from my village. I have further proof. I was with a wise woman, and she told me I had an ill neighbour, and that she would come to my house ere it were long, and so did she, and that she had a mark above her waist, and so had she. And God forgive me, my stomach hath gone against her a great while. Her mother before her was counted a witch. She hath been beat and scratched by the face, which was a remedy for trying to draw blood to break a spell that had been cast on you, because she hath been suspected. And afterwards some of those persons were sent to amend. And then Scott comes back into his own voice and says, these are the certainties that I hear in their evidences. You can see how dramatic this all is. You can see how entertaining this all is. We're going back to where we started this lecture with the idea of witchcraft as being entertaining. And even though Gifford's account, which I want you to look at here on the next slide, is not as entertaining, it too is intended to be delivered in quite a colloquial voice. It's a conversation between villagers in his text, and one of them is instructing the other ones. And he's trying to get them to imagine what it is that devils do, what it is that they should be thinking about people in their village that they think might be witches. His point, and this is a speaker called Daniel, is that he doesn't think devils can do quite as much as some people think they can. He keeps pointing out, because he's quite a godly figure, Daniel, that devils are not as powerful as people think they might be, because they're held in check by God. He says, devils would hurt and destroy with bodily harms both men and beasts and other creatures. But all the devils in hell are so chained up and bridled by this high providence, God's plan for everyone, that they cannot pluck the wing from one poor little wren without special leave given them from the ruler of the whole earth. And yet the witches are made believe that at their request, and to pleasure them by fulfilling their wrath, their spirits delay and kill both men and beasts, and then to spread this opinion among the people, these subtle spirits betray them, and will have them openly confess that they have done such great things, which all the devils at any man's request could never do. These are kind of chatty, practical accounts, and English demonologists proceed very much in this way. They often give you a kind of manual of prosecution, but it's often a manual that suggests you know what, you might want to hold back a bit. Never mind all this sex with the devil stuff. That's a thing they believe in Germany. We English people, we don't believe this. This is what we believe. This is what we think you should do about your neighbour if you think that they're a witch. And of course, they can use things like woodcut illustrations as another diagnostic tool. Does the woman in your village look like the woman in this woodcut? She might be a witch, especially if she's got a familiar with her. At the time, a cat or a bird or something like that. Okay, if you move on to the final slide then, I want you to think about what a witch is. I've given you another section from George Gifford's book here, and it's a definition of what a witch is. He says, a witch is one that worketh by the devil or by some curious art, either healing or revealing things secret or foretelling things to come, which the devil hath devised to ensnare men's souls withal unto damnation. The conjurer, the enchanter, the sorcerer, the diviner, and whatsoever other sort there is, encompassed within this circle. I want you to think about what you've learned in this lecture. What is a witch? Does this definition, Gifford's one, cover everything that we've looked at in the lecture or not? What are the gaps and differences? What else would you want to add from your learning in this lecture? What would you want to add into this definition? And looking ahead to the rest of the module, what else do you think we ought to add? What else is a witch?